A Liberal Utopia Behind Bars, Jeremy Bentham, and the Panopticon Prison, by Neil Davie. Jeremy Bentham's blueprint for a new kind of prison, the Panopticon, or inspection house, first conceived in 1786, jumped into the historiographical limelight with the publication of Michel Foucault's Surveiller et Punir, Naissance de la Prison. I don't know how to say that. It was published as Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Modern Prison in English. Bentham's, quote, glass beehive, end quote, with its ring of inward-facing cells under constant surveillance from a central observation tower, represented, according to Foucault, the locus classicus of a new conception of punishment which emerged in the closing years of the 18th century, one which sought to subjugate the mind as much as the body, its methods the inculcation of habits of obedience and deference through unchanging routine and backbreaking labor. The ultimate objective of this new disciplinary ideology, or Savoy, as Foucault termed it. Just know that any word that's in French is, my pronunciation is extremely dubious. As Foucault termed it, was the creation of a population of, quote, docile bodies, end quote, terrorized or indoctrinated so that each became the, quote, obedient subject, the individual subjected to habits, rules, orders, and authority that is exercised continually around him and upon him, end quote. Foucault emphasized the way in which Bentham's plans for his new prison, reflected in the neologism he coined to describe it, were intended to submit its 300 or so inmates to a regime of permanent unseen observation. Or to be more precise, Bentham figured that the illusion of permanent observation would suffice, with the prisoners under the impression that they were being watched, as he put it, quote, at every instant, end quote. The architectural details of the Panopticon were all specifically designed to maintain this sleight of hand, by combining, quote, the apparent omnipresence of the inspector, if divines will allow me the expression, with the extreme facility of his real presence, end quote. Unlike traditional circular buildings like chapels and theaters, in which one central event could be observed by many people, here was a structure in which the event was on the circumference and the audience in the center. The governor in his tower would indeed be omniscient. Foucault's, quote, eye of power, end quote, able to see into every last nook and cranny of the prison, whether by daylight or artificial light. The prison would be constantly lit up, quote, for the purposes of inspection, eyes in considerable numbers would be constantly availing themselves of that light, end quote. As far as the inmates were concerned, however, the governor and other prison staff would remain shadowy figures, rarely seen except as silhouettes in the deliberately gloomy inspection tower, hidden by blinds or smoked glass, or glimpsed for an instant as they moved behind a partition or through a door. This was the central paradox of the Panopticon noted by Bentham and taken up by Foucault. From the point of view of the administration, the inmates were, Bentham wrote, a, quote, multitude, end quote. But to themselves they were but, quote, solitary and sequestered individuals, end quote. Or as Foucault puts it, quote, in the peripheric ring, one is totally seen without ever seeing. In the central tower, one sees everything without ever being seen, end quote. This aspect of the Panopticon project is well known, at least in its essentials, and seen through the prism of 20th century totalitarianism. Bentham's unblinking, quote, eye of power, end quote, certainly provides a chilling symbol of absolute power in the hands of a repressive state. Indeed, the Panopticon would appear to rob its inmates of any vestige of privacy or dignity, reducing them to mere automatons, cut off from their fellows and even their gaolers, confined in a cross between a stone coffin and a goldfish bowl for 23 hours a day, with an hour of light relief spent on the treadwheel. Their, quote, every motion and every muscle, end quote, as Bentham put it, continually, quote, exposed to view, end quote. Even historian Janet Semple, Bentham's most sympathetic critic, is forced to concede that the prison was, quote, an instrument of power to subjugate men, of mind over mind, of endless invisible surveillance, end quote. A, quote, abhorrent institution, end quote. Janet Semple, Foucault and Bentham, A Defense of Panopticism. The intention of this paper is not to rehabilitate the Panopticon as an example of enlightened penal philosophy, a kind of new Lanark with bars, but rather to suggest that in Bentham's project, authoritarianism rubs shoulders with other philosophical traditions, including classical 18th and early 19th century economic and political liberalism. Indeed, we shall see that in some respects, the Panopticon's inventor considered his glass beehive to provide a model of social and economic arrangements superior to anything existing in, quote, real life, end quote, outside its walls, in short, a utopia. It might be objected that there are a number of fundamental stumbling blocks standing in the way of such reasoning. First of all, classical economic theory posits a rational, calculating model of human behavior, with each individual capable of assessing his own interest and making free choices on the basis of those interests. Sorry, where am I? Clearly, by definition, the criminal is not in a position to exercise free choices in this way. Indeed, with 23 hours a day spent in a cell under more or less constant supervision, it might be thought that it would be difficult to conceive of an environment with less opportunity for rational decision-making and choice-taking. Yet, for Bentham, it was vital that criminals learnt such skills if they were to be successfully reintegrated into society. There's some highlights here, so I guess I should read the highlights. That last sentence is highlighted. I guess I should say when it's highlighted. Highlight. Yet for Bentham, it was vital that criminals learnt such skills if they were to be successfully reintegrated into society. End highlight. This would take time, but Bentham shared with other penal reformers of the period the optimistic belief that bad physical and mental habits could be unlearned, and that the nefarious effects of drink, sexual immoderation, and above all idleness, believed to be at the root of crime, could be peeled away like the skins of a corrupted onion, and placed with a more wholesome commitment, and replaced with a more wholesome commitment to hard work and moral probity. Moral probity. Probity. However, where most of Bentham's contemporaries in the penal reform movement advocated a rigorous dose of soul-searching aided by strict separation and Christian instruction to cleanse the mind, coupled with a mind-numbing routine of hard physical labor to cleanse the body, the inventor of the Panopticon had other ideas. Highlight. For Bentham, criminals needed to be taught to think and behave rationally, to learn to recognize their, quote, real, end quote, interests. End highlight. Not succumb to the seductive but ultimately destructive temptations which had led them into crime in the first place. This was not going to be easy, he reckoned, for as he wrote, quote, and this is also highlighted, quote, end highlight, delinquents are a peculiar race of beings who require unremitted inspection. The delinquent's weakness consists in yielding to the seductions of the passing moment. Their minds are weak and disordered, and though their disease is neither so clearly marked nor so incurable as that of idiots and lunatics, like these they require to be kept under restraints, and they cannot without danger be left to themselves. End quote. End highlight. Bentham. Highlight. It was experience and self-interest, particularly pecuniary self-interest, which needed to be stimulated if criminals, these, quote, grown children, end quote, as he called them, were to be weaned off the criminogenic behaviors and attitudes which had been their undoing. End highlight. In other words, criminals needed to see for themselves that work paid and not crime. Highlight. The preferred penal remedy for much of the 19th century was simply to subject inmates to a regimen of forced labor. The more tedious and self-evidently useless, the better. End highlight. By the 1850s, the received wisdom in government and penal circles was that the threat of corporal punishment, possibly combined with a reduction of an already inadequate diet, would provide incentive enough for labor. Highlight. For Bentham, however, it was not enough to force prisoners to work. They needed to make the choice themselves. End highlight. In order to achieve this, given the unpromising raw material, powerful incentives, or as Bentham put it, quote, rewards, end quote, needed to be offered. In the 1791 postscripts, Bentham wrote, quote, I see no use in making it, bracket, labor, end bracket, either odious or infamous. To me it would seem but so much the better if a man could be taught to love labor, instead of being taught to loathe labor. Occupation, instead of being the prisoner's scourge, should be called, and should be made, as much as possible, a cordial to him. Cordial as in, like, friendly. End quote. Bentham. Bentham went on, quote, and highlight, reward, not punishment, is the office you must apply to. Compulsion and slavery must, in a race like this, be ever an unequal match for encouragement and liberty, and the rougher the ground, the more unequal. End quote. End highlight. Bentham. Highlight. Thus, in the Panopticon, no prisoner would be forced to labor at all. Each should be quite at liberty, as Bentham put it, to do nothing, quote, from morning till night, but to eat his bad bread and drink his water, without a soul to speak to, end quote. End highlight. For those choosing to work, on the other hand, there would be the, quote, reward, end quote, of occupying the long hours of solitary imprisonment, but in addition there would be a share in any profits made by the trade or manufacture carried out in the prison. In one of his writings, Bentham set his share at 25%, the remainder to be retained by the prison governor in lieu of a salary. The inmate's share would above all provide them with, quote, subsistence after the expiration of their terms, end quote. More immediately, it would also pay for, quote, meat and beer, or whatever else his earnings may afford them, end quote. Quote, not a single stroke does he strike, end quote, he adds, quote, but he gets something which he would not have got otherwise, end quote. Highlight. With classical liberal reasoning, end highlight, Bentham saw a perfect harmony of interest between the prisoner worker and governor contractor. For him, quote, the turning of the prisoner's labor into the most profitable channels, end quote, would depend, quote, upon the joint choice of the two only parties interested in pushing the advantage to the utmost, end quote. Presented in this way, labor in the Panopticon would appear to offer a perfect combination of the three principles according to which the Panopticon enterprise, in every sense of that term, was to be organized: leniency, severity, and economy. Highlight: the prisoner governor contractor would be forbidden by law from starving or physically mistreating the prisoners in his charge. So no whips or shackles, but within those limits set by the principle of, quote, leniency, end quote. Bentham appears to suggest that prisoners should be worked as hard as humanly possible, quote, severity, end quote, for as little as financial reward as possible, quote, economy, end quote, and highlight. Highlight, end quote. Or quote, a highlighted quote from Bentham. What hold can any other manufacturer have upon his workmen, Bentham asked, end bracket, equal to what my manufacturer would have upon his? What other master is there that can reduce his workmen, if idle, to a situation next to starving, without suffering them to go elsewhere? What other master is there whose men can never get drunk unless he chooses they should do so, and who, so far from being able to raise their wages by combination, are obliged to take whatever pittance he thinks it most for his interest to most for his interest to allow? Bracket, bracket. And to crown the whole by the great advantage, which is the peculiar fruit of his principle, what other master or manufacturer is there who, to appearance constantly, and in reality as much as he thinks proper, has every look and motion of each workman under his eye? End quote, and highlight. Bentham. In a sense, the labor relationship is reduced here to its purest and presumably for Bentham the most satisfactory form. Highlight: thus in the Panopticon workforce there is no problem of quote time work discipline, end quote. Workers would not be able to go elsewhere or choose their hours of work. Equally, there would be no risk that productivity would suffer from the immoderate consumption of alcohol, or profits be harmed by disruptive collective action. End highlight. In this way, the wheels of industry could have run with preternatural precision in the Panopticon, free of the grit which throws machinery off kilter in the real world. Highlight: all of this may appear to modern eyes what one historian has called, quote, a classic formula for the exploitation of labor, end quote. But as Janet Semple convincingly argues, quote, there is no necessary contradiction in perceiving the Panopticon both as a utopia and as an instrument of oppression, end quote. And highlight. Semple goes on, quote, sequestered from the sources of evil and idleness, bracket, behind the high walls of the Panopticon, end bracket, men would learn, bracket, Bentham believed, end bracket, to love labor. They would be inured to habitual industry and live peaceful, innocent, productive lives, end quote. Semple goes on to quote Krishan Kumar's more general remarks about Enlightenment utopias, which can equally be applied to the Panopticon. Quote, their overriding theme, quote, their overriding aim, end quote, Kumar writes, quote, is the elimination of social discord and individual unhappiness caused by unrestrained desires and strivings, end quote. Thus, for Bentham, the contract between governor and prisoner would be in the best interest of both, not merely a license to squeeze the last drop of productive effort from the Panopticon's captive workforce. Gradually, inmates would be liberated from the twin evils of drink and idleness, both endemic on the outside. Quote, the unrestrained desires and cravings, end quote, Kumar refers to, permitting the work ethic to be internalized. Only in this way, Bentham argued, could a life free from both poverty and crime be guaranteed for ex-prisoners. And highlight. The Panopticon's inmates might even, he argued in a private, undated note in the archives at University College London, be reconciled to the loss of liberty and deprivation of privacy during their enforced stay in prison. Quote, in time, end quote, he wrote, quote, they will become accustomed to it, and the galling roughness of their chains will be smoothed away by use, end quote. Bentham. Financial interest was not only at the heart of the contract between the governor and prisoner, it was also conceived by Bentham as a powerful regulatory mechanism. Just as modern liberal economists and policymakers argue that financial penalties imposed on polluting firms are the best way of controlling environmental waste, so, highlight, Bentham argued that monetary gain or loss was the most effective way to ensure that the governor performed his duties, and highlight, efficiently and zealously. Thus, the governor-contractor was to be fined £50 for each successful escape, up to £25 if an ex-prisoner was reconvicted, with a sliding scale according to the gravity of the crime, and even made to pay, quote, so much for every one that died, end quote. This novel kind of life insurance scheme, already practiced in the period by the British government in its dealings with shipping companies transporting convicts to the penal colony of Botany Bay, which was in Australia. If you're familiar with Irish folk music at all, there's a very good song called The Fields of Athenry, which I think they sing at, like, the soccer games that are, like, where the fans are, like, I don't know, Irish nationalists or something like that. And it's a very good song, but it's about an Irish man who steals wheat from an English-owned farm and is shipped off to Botany Bay. And his wife is left behind to raise their children. The lyrics are like, against the famine and the crown, I rebelled, they shot me down. Now you must raise our child in dignity. It's a good song, you should listen to it, it's good. Fields of Athenry. Where am I? Let me reread that sentence before I start singing like an ass. This novel kind of life insurance scheme, already practiced in the period by the British government in its dealings with shipping companies transporting conflicts to the penal colony of Botany Bay, may offend modern human notions of the dignity of human life. But for Bentham, highlight, it was infinitely preferable to simply relying on government officials to obey rules, and highlight. Quote, legal penalties, end quote, Bentham observed, quote, afford very little security against destructive habits, against being killed by inches or by neglect, worn out by want of rest or nourishment, poisoned by bad provisions or unwholesome trades and occupations, end quote. Bentham. In this respect, Bentham was remarkably prescient. When his own ideas for a prison run by contract were turned down in 1811 in favor of a regime based on a bureaucracy of salaried prison administrators, the kind of, quote, destructive habits, end quote, death by neglect, end quote, bad provisions, end quote, unwholesome trades, end quote, to which he referred, soon became the daily lot of thousands of inmates in British Gauls. I'm going to look up how to pronounce that word right now, because I never feel like I'm pronouncing it right, because it's... What does Google Translate tell me? It's
jail. Jail.
Are you fucking serious?
Jail.
That ain't right. How to pronounce...
Jail.
It's fucking hilarious. I've been saying it very wrong. Apparently, it's just the English spelling of jail. I mean, the English the English spelling of, like, the British, or... Yeah, I guess the English, English spelling of jail. G-A-O-L. Let me reread the sentence it was in. When his own ideas for a prison run by contract were turned down in 1811 in favor of a regime based on a bureaucracy of salaried prison administrators, the kind of, quote, destructive habits, end quote, death by neglect, end quote, bad provisions, end quote, unwholesome trades, end quote, to which he referred, soon became the daily lot of thousands of inmates in Britain's jails. Whether Bentham's plan of, quote, joining interest and duty, end quote, the strongest cement that can be found, end quote, would have improved matters, remains, of course, a moot point. Bentham had other weapons in his regulatory armory besides that of hitting the governor-contractor where it hurt most, in his wallet. Firstly, the government would have been answerable to the King's Bench Court. Highlight. He would have to present an annual report on the moral, medical, and economic condition of the establishment, and answer questions regarding prison management. End highlight. More interesting than this reference to the courts, a similar expedient of the period, and often criticized for their ineffectiveness, was a second additional form of regulation. Bentham's quote, inspection house, end quote. Oh, the highlight ended. Sorry. Highlight, he would have to present an annual report on the moral, medical, and economic condition of the establishment and answer questions regarding prison management. End highlight. More interesting than this reference to the courts, a familiar expedient of the period, and often criticized for their ineffectiveness, was a second additional form of regulation. Bentham's, quote, inspection house, end quote, was intended to live up to its name in more ways than one, for it was intended that the prison governor and guards would not be the only eyes trained on the Panopticon's inmates from the vantage point of the observation tower, giving a new twist to the concept of justice being seen to be done. Highlight, Bentham planned to give the general public unlimited access to the prison. And highlight. The doors of the Panopticon, Bentham wrote, quote, ought to be thrown wide open to the body of the curious at large, the great open committee of the tribunal of the world, end quote. Quote, it is, quote, is it possible, end quote, he asked elsewhere, quote, that a national penitentiary house of this kind should be more at a loss for visitors than the lions, the waxworks, or the tombs, end quote. And where better to attract visitors than London, that, quote, great seat of inspection, end quote. Excuse me. There was nothing new, of course, in admitting the public to penal institutions. The condemned cells at Newgate Jail in London, for example, were a popular tourist attraction in the 18th century. But the highlight, Panopticon's visitors were expected to do more than enjoy the spectacle. For Bentham, public scrutiny was a vital counterweight to official power. And highlight. Bentham was aware that his plan gave the governor-contractor sweeping powers, and even if he reckoned that financial interest would generally ensure the prisoners were well treated, the potential for neglect and abuse, as well as sheer incompetence, remained a real one. Visitors could thus see for themselves that the three principles of leniency, severity, and economy were being respected in practice. In this way, Bentham reckoned neither, quote, avarice nor negligence, bracket, could, end bracket, hope to find a lurking place, end quote. Indeed, like for the prisoners, it was not necessary for the prison staff to be under observation at every moment. The mere expectation of public scrutiny at any moment of the day or night would be enough to prevent abuses, so the argument ran. Highlight. Bentham may well have overestimated the regulatory potential of the public gaze at the Panopticon. End highlight. Who is to say, for example, that visitors would not have welcomed the ill treatment of prisoners as a case of just deserts rather than condemned it? Possibly the governor-contractor, too, as Gertrude Himmelfarb suggests, quote, so far from being inspired to great exertions of neatness and cleanliness, bracket, by the public gaze, end bracket, might try to compete with the asylum, Magdalen or Lock Hospital in picturesque and exotic horrors, end quote. Himmelfarb. That being said, it is interesting to note that Bentham draws here on a contemporary strand of political liberalism which stressed the importance of public accountability and open government. A modern parallel could be drawn here with plans to install CCTV cameras in police interview rooms. In both cases, there is an assumption that agents of state power cannot be trusted implicitly not to abuse that power, and that some form of external independent monitoring is necessary in order to verify compliance. This issue raises difficulties if we wish to consider the Panopticon as a fully fledged utopia. In certain of its other aspects, there did exist, as we have seen, a utopian emphasis on the creation of a social and economic system, both isolated from, and in some respects superior to, the outside world. Like other idealized blueprints for society, Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon project aimed to replace the messiness of the real world with a model of regulated, rational behavior rooted in the tenets of classical liberalism. But this could never be a self-sufficient, self-regulating community. Its raison d'etre. Dude, I don't know how to say that word either. I'm going to look that up. I always say raison d'etre, but I don't know if that's how you actually say it. Ah, come on, man.
This
I don't
is
have to
where
like
we
sit
enter-
through an ad just to get one here fucking words. Oh my god.
Near the future of space.
I'm gonna kill myself.
You see, the
Raison d'etre.
Raison d'etre. Raison d'etre. Okay. Its raison d'etre was, after all, an external penal code, with all but a handful of its inhabitants to be sent there against their will, according to the dictates of that code. Moreover, the economic viability and public accountability of the whole enterprise were both critically dependent on forces and institutions outside the prison walls, and indeed outside the control of the prison regime. If the Panopticon can be described as a utopia, it was thus one of a very peculiar kind. Right. End of essay. Thank you for bearing with me while I looked up those words. So we learned Gaol is pronounced jail, which is just a different spelling of jail. And we learned that raison d'etre is how you pronounce what I was saying, is